Welcome to the Phillip Wylie Show. Take a look behind the curtain of professional hacking and hear compelling discussions with guests from diverse backgrounds who share a common curiosity and passion for challenges and their job. And now, here's your host, offensive security professional, educator, mentor, and author, Phillip Wylie.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Phillip Wylie Show. Today I'm really excited to have Jeff Mann joining. Jeff Mann is one of the OGs in the industry. He's been doing this stuff for a long time, has a really good, a very interesting story, not your typical story. I've heard, you hear people from time to time claiming some of these type of stories, but this guy's the real deal. So it's, and also he's also a podcaster for Paul's Security Weekly, just to kind of give into a little bit about his details, but we're going to dive into that a little bit deeper when he shares his hacker origin story. So welcome to the show, Jeff.
Thanks, Philip. It's great to be here, and it's fun to be on the other side of the microphone for a change and be on the spot rather than be the one doing the interview.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you on. That out of the podcast I've been on, Paul's Security Weekly was probably my favorite. So good to have
it's
you
one
on.
Of my favorites too.
That's good.
Week in, week out. I was just at the Hope Conference this past weekend, and several people walked up to me and say, "Hey, you're Jeff Mann. You're on the Paul Security Weekly," and then they would proceed to tell me, different things about how much they like the show or how much they like my contributions. Being the level-headed sage old timer that's seen it all, done it all, and tries to keep a rein in on some of the other co-hosts' unbridled enthusiasm, shall we say.
So yeah, Paul's Security Weekly wasn't that, if that wasn't the first security podcast, probably one of the first.
Yeah, definitely one of the first. It's in the top 3 or 5 anyway, going on almost 20 years that Paul and Larry Pesce were the 2 original founders of it. They literally started it in Paul's basement almost 20 years ago. I joined. I keep thinking I should look up the exact date of the first time I was on the show, but I want to say it goes back to the beginning of 2015. So, going on 8 or 9 years that I've been a part of the show. Starting to add up.
Yeah. Yeah, time flies by. It's just crazy how time flies. When you're younger, you just really think of things, this is forever, but then you really think of things when you're starting to plan things. You look at 3-year or 5-year plans. That's really not a long time when you really think about it anymore.
It really is. I mean, when I was a kid, I was like, Y2K, year 2000, that's never going to happen. I'll be 38 years old when that happens. It's forever in the future. And now we're almost a quarter of a century beyond Y2K. We're only 2 years away from celebrating the 250th anniversary of the country, the founding of the country. I remember the bicentennial. I grew up outside of Washington, D.C., and I was down on the mall, near the Washington Monument for the bicentennial, which was still one of the coolest things that I ever experienced. But, that was almost 50 years ago. So all that to say is I'm an OG. I'm a relic in life, yet alone this what we now call an industry.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting how things have evolved, because I remember when I was in IT and I got my start in 97 in IT. And I remember a lot of companies didn't have dedicated security groups. It was the network guys managing the firewalls. And so the company I work for, the mortgage company I work for, I went to work for them in 98. And I guess by 2000 or so, they added their own security teams. But it's just kind of interesting to see that although the industry's been around for a while, not everyone has actually had a security team.
Well, I would say even to this day, there's a lot of companies that don't have a security team, which is one of my grievances against the marketing segment of our industry that always is focusing the messaging and the marketing pitches to the enterprise and teams. And, they assume so much of an organizational structure that almost necessarily is reserved for a relatively few number of companies. Several years ago, I worked for a vendor. I ordinarily don't like vendors, just because I've worked on the consulting side of the fence, as it were, being a trusted advisor and vendor neutral for many years. And I have to deal with customers that bought so many things that either didn't work, or they don't know how to make it work, or they're just not sure what to do with it. And, but they spend, they basically blow their whole budget on something, and then they're left, what do we do with it? But yeah, that notwithstanding, I was working for this vendor, almost 10 years ago now, and they were going through a marketing campaign where they were putting together sort of the buyer personas of these people that they would find within an organization, and, how to tailor the messaging to different people within an organization. And I was reporting to the marketing department at that time. So I sat through that whole presentation that the people that had put these personas, and they had little avatars and little personalities and backstories for everybody. And at some point they asked me what I thought. And I said, well, this is really cool, but, I've been working with hundreds of companies over the last 20 some odd years. I've never met these people. So as far as I was concerned, they didn't exist, but they certainly existed in the minds of somebody, and maybe they existed in one or two, enterprise level premier clients that this vendor had. But to me, it just underscored sort of the disconnect that often exists between different, aspects of vendor companies. Once you get beyond the founders and the visionaries that came up with this great idea, and you start talking to people that are in charge of selling it and in charge of presenting it and trying to make it interesting and compelling and so on and so forth, sometimes the messaging gets lost. And it's not anybody's fault necessarily. There's lots of reasons why that happens. But, I try to be a little bit more sensitive to vendors these days, because after working for a vendor, where before I went to work for the vendor, I thought, oh, vendors just lie. Then I worked for a vendor. It's like, oh, they're not lying. They're just ignorant. They just don't really know. All they know is is what copy is put before them. And the people that are in the know aren't often involved in that process. So I try to educate, and I try to help people understand how all this stuff works as much as possible. I mean, technology's around to stay, vendors are around to stay, and you're going to buy something. But my goal is always to make sure that my customer is making informed buying decisions, and they know why they're buying something or investing in something or subscribing to something, which I probably should say these days, before they run off and do it, and not just simply rely on, well, the vendor says that I should have it. How can I live without it? Kind of like the old, Kirby vacuum cleaner salesman or Fuller Bush salesman that would come to your door, and, how could I ever live without this? It's amazing. Or what was the vacuum cleaner where they used to suck a bowling ball? I'm like, well, that's just simple physics.
Yeah,
it
was a rainbow.
The crappiest vacuum cleaner in the world can pick up a bowling ball. Anyway, I digress.
I saw I for a brief time started to try to, signed up to sell the rainbow vacuum cleaners, but back before I had a professional career. But my parents had one of the Kirby vacuum cleaners too. Man, those things were expensive, even way back.
Yeah, they were. And that's what they relied on. And, just like so many, so many technologies that are out there in cybersecurity, which, by the way, I hate it that people call them solutions, because what have we actually solved in this industry after 30, 35 years, depending on how long, which I've been around for since the very beginning. So I guess I am qualified to say that, but we've solved very little. So I prefer to refer to all the technologies as tools. If I do anything before I leave this industry, it's to get people to choose their words a little bit more carefully and know what the words mean before they use them. Probably a losing battle, but I'll keep chasing that windmill.
So why don't you share with our listeners your hacker origin story, kind of how you got started and what you're doing today?
I will try to be as succinct as possible. when we interview people on our podcast, we ask them how they got their start in cybersecurity. And, I've answered that question over the years when people ask it of me, of saying, well, I got my start at NSA. But at some point I realized, well, that's not really a good answer to the question. The real answer to the question is, how did I get to NSA? Because NSA really was the springboard for my career in cybersecurity, which was what we call it today. Very quickly, my parents relocated to the Washington, D.C. area back in the early 50s. My dad was a physicist, and he went to work for Naval Research Laboratory as a nuclear physicist. They were developing the first hydrogen bombs, and my dad had, one of the favorite stories told around the dinner table was my dad was a witness to the detonation of the first hydrogen device, which obliterated an atoll in the South Pacific called Eniwetok. Google it. I don't know how to spell it, but Google it. So I, grew up in a smart family, youngest of 4 boys. We loved doing puzzles, all of us. Crossword puzzle books were a thing back in those days. When we would go on vacation in the summer, my dad would buy a Dell crossword puzzle magazine, and we would pass it around on the beach, take turns doing the different types of puzzles. I kind of always enjoyed the crypto puzzles, the crypto quizzes, the cryptograms, some of the other puzzles. All of us, my brothers and my dad and I, we all loved doing the logic problems. There was always 1 or 2 logic problems in every magazine where they would give you like 5 or 6 statements about, students at a school and their favorite teachers and what was the subject and what was the color of the classroom. And so you had to figure out, who the students were. It was usually like 5 or 6 people, who was their favorite teacher, what was their favorite subject, what was the classroom that the subject was taught in, based on like 6 or 7 different statements, like Johnny goes to the class between the green and the yellow classroom, and little bits and pieces, and you logically have to work it all out. Fast forward to I go to college. I was a business major, graduated with a business degree, and was looking for a job, looking for a career position. Was working at the time as a sort of a temporary employee for various departments of the Navy. But applied to work at the National Security Agency, was asked to come to Fort Meade in Maryland, which is where the NSA is located. I can say that now. And for 2 or 3 days, I took a series of aptitude tests, skills tests. I've learned over the years it's kind of similar to tests that are given in various armed forces to sort of determine what your career path should be, or what your skill sets are, what your assignment should be. I scored really well on the tests, and so I was hired by NSA, and then I had to actually get an assignment, and I went on a bunch of job interviews internally, and one of the offices that I interviewed with, it was something called manual crypto systems. So they were in charge of one-time pads, codes and ciphers, the things that we think about when we think about sort of classic secret sharing, things from World War II and stuff like that, the little orphan Annie decoder ring and anything like that. That was something that was very much a part of secure communications. This was in the mid 1980s, which is when I was interviewing for this office. Well, the guy that did the interview was a cryptanalyst on loan from sort of the main side of the house operations. He was a cryptanalyst. He had been there in this office 10 years prior, 15 years prior, back in the 70s, early 70s, as an intern himself. And so he was back sort of on a loan for like 6 months. And he ended up talking me into coming to work for this organization. It sounded kind of cool. I got to do some pretty interesting things. But one thing that I realized at some point, lunch break or something one day, this guy was at his desk and he had some graph paper out and colored pencils, and he was doing all sorts of weird stuff and drawing and writing and taking notes. So I was like, yes, what are you doing? He's like, well, I'm writing a logic problem. I said, oh, a logic problem? Tell me more. He says, well, as a side job, I write logic problems and sell them to Dell Crossword Puzzle magazine. I was like, that was like the karma moment. It's like, wow, I know I'm in the right place. So in that office in the late 80s, very beginning of sort of the impact and influence of computers, at least in terms of secure communications for NSA. They were responsible for building all the encryption devices and machines, and it was mostly machines back then, and it was mostly protecting radio signals, voice signals, all the various spectrums of sound waves. But if you've seen old war movies, people talking into radios that are attached to a backpack, there's also things on the backpack that do the cryptography, that scramble the signal and stuff like that. Well, I was there at the very beginning of sort of the digital age and people wanting to do things in software. So one of the things I was able to do that first couple of years is, and to the best of my knowledge, this is a true statement, I was able to design and have produced and field the first crypto system that NSA produced that was software based. Later on, I helped another client, U.S. Special Forces, with updating their emergency crypto system, which is a memory system. And in doing that, I inadvertently invented a cipher wheel that emulated the algorithm, as it were, that they used to use a one-time pad, which is based on something called a Visionaire square. So think of a alphabet A to Z, and A to Z row and column, and then a whole table where it's filled up with, in this case, a reverse of the alphabet with every row it's offset one letter at a time. If it doesn't make sense to you, Google it. But I came up with a way of emulating that lookup on a table on a little cipher wheel and ended up mass producing them for U.S. Special Forces. They used it for, as far as I can tell, more than a decade, until they completely replaced all their systems with, secure phones and smartphones and things like that. A copy of that cipher wheel is actually on display right now at the National Cryptologic Museum, which is right outside of the National Security Agency at Fort Meade. So, something I invented in the 80s is actually on display in a museum. They're excited because the person that was responsible for it's still alive, because obviously they got a lot of artifacts there that go back hundreds of years. So that was the first couple of years at NSA. The last couple of years at NSA, when the internet was kind of becoming a big thing and more people were publicly getting on the internet by way of web browsers, I tell the story that, the world changed and I should have the date memorized, but it was 1993 when the first browser came out. Mosaic was publicly released. I mean, we were already on a network. There was already the internet, but it was Telnet and FTP and various rudimentary database searching tools that, people can rattle off what they remember, Archie and Veronica and things like that. So there was a network and it was sort of called the internet, but it wasn't the thing that we know of today. But I was in an office at that point that was responsible for doing security evaluations of systems that were already in the field. And part of that included networked systems. And so somewhere along the line of evaluating the network systems and the internet becoming a thing, a small group of us thought, why don't we just learn how to be hackers and break into them? And we thought that's a great idea. So we started doing that. So we sort of formed our own little pen testing team and learned how to break into first our own networks, which some admins weren't happy about. But then we were going around being asked to do security evaluations of other NSA was responsible for all the classified networks in the government. So we were doing all the different classified networks, anything that had classified information. And this was in the early 90s, so 30 some odd years ago, where there were no educational courses, there were no degrees in college, there were no training courses, there were no certifications. SANS didn't exist, at least in the way that it exists today. GIAC, ISACA, ISSA, all of those, they all came about around that time. But as you were alluding to earlier, I mean, the people that first got involved with the network security or internet security, which was what we called it back then, were sort of doing it out of necessity because it was their systems. They were the network admins, they were the IT admins, they were the server admins, they were the DBAs, and so on and so forth. And very often the guy that was tagged to do security was the guy that was out the day when they went looking. So it's like, hey, guess what you're doing now that you're back from vacation? So early 90s to mid 90s got involved in setting up a pen testing team. And when I say pen testing, that's all we called it back then. There was no distinguishing red, blue, purple, yellow teams. There was no mention of offense and defense, other than at a macro level, the offensive side of NSA, which is responsible for capturing communications from all over the world and decoding them, decrypting them, deciphering them, and interpreting them, let's say. That was offense, or we called it operations. And then we worked on the side of what was called InfoSec, information security. That was more or less what was defense. So what we did, we considered to be defensive. Let's break into your network and figure out what the holes are before the real bad guy does it, so that we can preempt something bad from happening. Lots of stories about that. There were no methodologies. We kind of created them as we went along. Got involved in some projects with government agencies being compromised. And in those days, compromises or breaches were simply they got their website defaced. So it was relatively benign. There was nothing stolen. It was just more a black eye to the government. So we dabbled in some early forensics exercises, again, without much guidance, because nobody had written anything down at that point. There were no published books or manuals or training courses or certifications. So did that. That's kind of the origin story. The group that we were in came to be known as the Pit. So somewhere in the folklore of NSA, people that have worked there might have heard that the first NSA red team was the Pit, or worked out of the Pit. The Pit was actually the nickname that we gave to our office because we were trying to be geeky and live like hackers and live the hacker lifestyle. And, there was no Red Bull back then. We drank a lot of Mountain Dew, and I grew my hair long. I had hair, and Fridays were Hawaiian shirt days, and we were just trying to be geeky and dabble and learn everything we could about computer and network security and how to break into things. And in those days, a lot of the ways systems and networks were exploited were really just exploiting the features of the operating systems of the day. There was some exploitation. There were some, we didn't really even have the term 0 day or O day back then. It was like, well, we know this is running this particular application or executable, and we know how to exploit that. We know how to get it to hiccup and dump, basically halt execution and dump out into a root shell. We know FTP was a fun thing. Telnet was a fun thing. Insecure protocols, network sniffing, grabbing passwords and credentials off the network. Oh, by the way, everything back then was basically publicly addressable. There was not much a concept of internal or private addressing. Everything had to have an internet reachable address, no matter where you were on the network. And, oh, by the way, if you're plugging into the internet as a backbone, you better have something in place to protect you, which was in the early days a firewall. Of course, a firewall, there's many ways to circumvent a firewall, because while you're setting up the firewall to protect the internal network, your corporate network, as it were, you're also setting up web servers and mail servers and name servers and all sorts of things that necessarily talk to the internet either through or very often around the firewall. So a lot of the early days of penetration testing for me was simply learning how stuff worked and what the potential and possibilities were, and then going back to organizations and say, okay, this is the way you have it set up, and this is why that's not good enough, and this is how we exploited it. So let's talk about what you're trying to accomplish and how you can set that up and architect it in a way that's going to give you a better chance at defense. So that's kind of my origin story. Lots of, I'm a storyteller. I could tell many stories, but that's at a high level. I got my start at NSA, and I didn't really call myself a hacker until in the last couple of years, looking back on my life, I'm like, yeah, I really am a hacker. And I was a hacker from a young age. Hacker to me is somebody that's curious, inquisitive, looking for a better way to do things, not accepting status quo, always looking for a better way, a more simplified way, more efficient way to do things. And that's not just computer and network hacking. That's just one small aspect of it. I mean, I haven't broken into a network or a computer system in over 20 years, but I still call myself a hacker because it's all up here.
So kind of what are some of your thoughts on just kind of the evolution of pen testing, because you see how complex things have gotten now. So what are your thoughts on how the evolution of pen testing?
Well, even the question assumes that it's moved forward. I'm not convinced that there has been an evolution, is what I'm trying to say. I think penetration testing is a very valuable exercise. And let me qualify my answer by saying the way I would define penetration testing in this context. It's not the absolute right definition, but just so people have some understanding of what I'm talking about when I say penetration testing. To me, it's a no holds barred effort for somebody in an authorized manner to try to, in an unannounced way, do something to you, either penetrate your network, gain access to your network and systems, gain some level of control, and or steal something, or demonstrate that you could have gotten to some data set or some set of information and done something to it, like steal it, or inhibit your operations, denial of service, and or this is something we did early on in my commercial days of pen testing, simply just try to test your defenses, be noisy. Hey, we're pen testing now. We're trying to probe your network and break in, and let's see if you can catch us and notice that we're doing things and respond to it. Now, there's absolutely been evolution and advancement, because the way the pen testing was done 30, 35 years ago is not the same way it's done now in terms of techniques, although I'd argue the methodology is still roughly the same. But by the same token, I hear lots of people talking about penetration testing, and especially, I have to say, I do PCI. I've been doing PCI for 20 years, so I don't do pen tests, but I read a lot of pen test reports. And 99% of the time, they're vulnerability assessment reports. We're finding all the vulnerabilities, not just simply exploiting them, but here's all the weaknesses that we've found in your network. And very often, it's output from a vulnerability scanner. So what's the value add to a pen test when everything that's in the pen test you could have gotten from just simply running a vulnerability scanner? So it's a mixed bag. And of course, what I'm describing as penetration testing, I've come to learn that more people ascribe the term red team exercise this day, or they'll talk about it being offensive attacks or offensive penetration testing versus defense, red team, blue team. I'll put it out there, agree or disagree, but to me, all of security is defensive by definition, because you're all working on the side of protection ultimately, even though you might be playing an adversarial role. That to me is not offensive. That to me is an aspect of defense, but it's semantics. But again, it goes back to sales and marketing pitches and slogans and campaigns, and we throw this terminology around, and very quickly nobody knows what any of this terminology means. They just know it's really important and neat, and so they got to use it in a sentence and say that we do it. And yeah, I talk to a lot of vendors and people at booths at a lot of conferences and trade shows, and I spent a lot of time going around trying to correct people on the misuse of terminology. So very rarely do I see a pen test report that's actually, we tried to break in, or we tried to gain access, or we tried to gain unannounced access. In fact, it was about 10 years ago, I went to DerbyCon, And it was the first time, I had just recently gone to work for this vendor, and I had been taking a break from doing PCI as an assessor and always being a billable resource and never being allowed to go to conferences at all. So my first hacker conference that I'd been to pretty much ever, because they didn't pretty much exist back when I was doing pen testing. All we had back then was a SANS conference and a Usenix conference. That was about it. DEF CON existed. I just never went to it. But the keynote for the DerbyCon that I went to, you can look back, it was 14 or 15. I think it was 14. Ed Scotus was giving the keynote, and the title of his talk was something to the effect of how to give the world's best pen test. So I thought, well, that's really cool. I've been out of pen testing for 10-ish years. I'll get to see what's changed and what's different. And I did not know Ed at the time. I do know him now. We're friends, and we've talked about this. So I'm not talking behind his back in any way. But I listened to his keynote, and the first thing I wanted to know was, well, define penetration testing. What is it today after me being sort of away from it for 10 years? He didn't do that. And I thought, well, at least describe attributes of it. Like, what's the goal of penetration testing? What are the objectives of penetration testing? Are you, like I was saying earlier, are you trying to steal something? Are you trying to get somewhere? Are you trying to prove that you could get somewhere? Are you trying to evade detection systems and do something unauthorized? There was none of that. All he basically said was the best pen test has lots of juicy results and you have unlimited time and resources. And I was sitting there thinking, to me, the world's most perfect pen test would be a total utter failure because the target was secure or they detected you early and so you couldn't do anything. So I sort of came away from that talk encouraged to, okay, I need to get back into this industry and start teaching and explaining people because something seems to have been lost. And it took a few years, but we did finally have a roundtable discussion for Security Weekly's, gosh, I want to say it was our 10th anniversary. No, I think it was our 500th episode. And we had a big roundtable, and Ed Scotus was part of the roundtable. And I sort of set up that discussion with what I just described to you. Ed, I saw you on your keynote and I thought you did a miserable job. And to paraphrase, he agreed with me, but then we had a whole big conversation about what penetration testing, what it was and is and could be, but often is reduced to. And there's lots of competitive forces at hand, the commodity aspect, the idea that penetration testing, you're never done. There's never enough time. There's never enough resources. It's point of time assessment. It's often reduced to vulnerability assessment. Most people know that they need to have one. They think it's a cool thing. They think it's a sexy thing. For those of us in the industry, we as a hacker community build up pen testing and pen testers as sort of the ultimate position. Those are the smartest, coolest, most in-demand speakers at conferences, and we lift all those people up on pedestals. And very often, the people that are put in those positions are very cool individuals, cool humans, and very humble, and they don't like the fact that they're put on pedestals. It's what we do to them. So this is not an indictment against anybody individually, but sort of collectively, we raise pen testing up as sort of the ultimate hacker position in this community, in this world. And while it's cool and fun, there's just so many other aspects to this industry. There's so many other aspects to cybersecurity or information security, which is what I think of it as. And I hate to use sports analogies, but I will. But on a sports team, I'll try to be generic. Any team any sport that's a team sport, you have specialty positions. American football, who is always glamorized? The quarterbacks, the wide receivers, the running backs. You're very rarely hearing about the guys that are in the trenches doing the blocking and tackling. Tackling maybe on defense, but name the offensive guard, right tackle, left end, right tight end for any sports team. Most people can't do that. Name the quarterback, they can do that. It's kind of like that with pen testers. The people that really matter, the people that make a difference, are very often the unsung heroes, and their stories are relatively boring. Well, yeah, I was looking at terabytes of data, which I do, 8 hours a day, 17 days a week, and I never get a break. But this one time I saw something weird and different, and I dug into it and investigated it, and I discovered that we had a problem, and I saved the day. When we save the day, sometimes we'll hear that story. When we find out that the bad guys have been in there in the network and have been stealing data for the last 18, 24 months, yeah, it's usually not a good day for anybody at that organization. So evolution of pen testing, it's certainly a major feature of our industry still, but I think we put too much emphasis and we glorify it too much, especially because we don't do this to this day, in my opinion, do a very good job of defining it and putting it in the proper context. I'll say this in sort of in closing for this question. In the world of PCI is a standard that maps out how to build a data security and information security program in an organization, and it outlines the major component parts, and I think a fairly comprehensive level at a high level. There are 12 major requirements, and it starts with build a secure network, build secure systems, protect the data that you care about. In this case, it's credit card data, but protect that data anywhere it's stored or anywhere it's transmitted. Keep all the things that you're doing secure, which is what, by the way, PCI calls vulnerability management, and then start looking at things like access controls, both physical and logical access, and limit access to the people that need to know, limit the escalation of privileges, and do that in a way where there's, what do we call it these days? IAM. In the old days, we called it authorization and authentication, and now it's identity access management because marketing. And then do security things like logging and monitoring and detection and response, and look for everything everywhere. And then do the things like vulnerability scanning to find things that you've missed, find failures in your procedures that are pushing out patches, pushing out updates, pushing out configuration changes, and so on and so forth. And then ultimately do a pen test, which to me, my interpretation of that is a pen test in its proper place is a combination of a live fire test. How well does your defenses work? Everything you've built into your security program, how well does it work? But not just from a stop everything and defend everything perspective. Equally as important is, can you detect when something anomalous and bad is happening and detect it early so that you can minimize the damages? I mean, the mere fact that a whole section of PCI has to do with making sure you have logging enabled and you keep the logs so that you have a forensic trail should indicate to anybody that PCI does not exist, not believe that you're never going to be without incident. They want to make sure that you're prepared when there is an incident to maybe catch the bad guy, or at least, quantify what the damages are, isolate what the affected systems were and the causes, and, patch it and move on. So that's, I could talk for hours on pen testing, obviously. Those are some of my thoughts on pen testing. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. So one of the questions I have is, what would you recommend for someone that's wanting to get pen testing services? Because, sometimes people go in not knowing better and they need to have a pen test done for PCI compliance. Mm-hmm. For instance, would you add any more guidance to that outside of them when they're looking for this consulting company to do that? Some other things that they could do to make this a more effective exercise?
Well, funny that you should ask the question that way, because I very often effectively answer this question to a lot of my PCI clients, in as much as they're not asking the question, but I try to encourage them to get the most out of the pen test since they have to do it anyway. And mileage varies for companies that I've had as clients that are building a lot of the applications and services that they're providing that are subject to PCI. I will encourage them to take advantage of the pen testing to focus on different areas. I mean, one of the misconceptions is the pen test has to be comprehensive and address everything. It really doesn't have to be that way. At least in PCI, the language is loose enough that you have the opportunity to kind of pick and choose your focus areas, if you will. So, I had a client a few years ago, they were building an application. I said, why don't you do a pen test, just pen test that application and really kick the tires on it and see if it holds up, especially since it was an application that was going to be used by, let's say, call center agents but they were remote. They were going to be phoning in from home type of thing. I said, you should really kick the tires on that. I would count a pen test result of like a security test against that application. I would count that. And it was more of a device. It wasn't just software. They were building some little, switch or something that they were going to put in their call center agents' homes. But I try to encourage people to figure out a reason why. Why would you do a pen test? What are you trying to get out of the pen test? Don't just go off and do it and pay for the cheapest one that gives you this big long list of vulnerabilities that you could have done with a cheaper vulnerability scanner or maybe even some sort of freeware vulnerability scanner and gotten the answers other locations. Try to figure out a goal, try to figure out an objective, try to make the most out of the pen tests. And frankly, over the years, I've had clients where I've sort of encouraged them to take advantage of the fact that they have to do something like PCI. And I've said to many IT admins and maybe many security people, hey, look, I know you know your network. I know you know what's right and what's wrong and the weak points. And I know you need stuff and I know you need resources. Let me make a deal with you. Work with me because, I'm the bad guy auditor and I'm the, person that doesn't know anything. Trust me, let's work through this, but let's use PCI as a way to get the things that you need, because your management and your executives, your company, and I know they don't understand security, but they know that they have to do PCI. So if you have something you want, or if you have something you need, share it with me. Let me slap PCI on it and I'll get it for you. And they would do it and they would get it. And then then I was a trusted advisor. Then I was an ally. So I guess I would, for all the different security things that you need to do, any individual thing like a pen test, the purpose of it can get lost in the whole long list of things that are required and, we have to do it. And, there's a cost associated with many of those things. Try to isolate what the purpose is and try to get the most out of it and try to get something out of it and make it cost effective in terms of, we got to spend the money anyway. Let's do something that's going to give us a result that's going to benefit us either by being more secure or, demonstrating that we need to invest more resources in people or stuff or training or whatever it is. That's what I try to do with my clients with, some level of success. It doesn't always work, but at least I can go to sleep at night thinking, well, at least I tried. At least I feel like they're making a more informed decision on what they're buying or what they're investing in, whether it's pen testing or anything really.
Yeah, that's great advice because, sometimes you talk to a consulting company, they're just going to give you exactly what you want. And so it's a good idea to have someone that's acting as a trusted advisor to help you dig down and make the most of your expenditure. So I like that.
Well, and I've worked with people over the years that consider themselves to be consultants and trusted advisors, and then I ask them where did you just come from, and it was from a vendor, and I'm like, well, there's no way you can have a trusted advisor that's also your salesperson for your vendor or your security architect or whatever vanity title they're giving them, there's sort of this built-in conflict of interest. I'm not saying that they can't, and in an individual level, they're not conscientious, but just on paper, somebody that's selling you something is probably not the person that should be seeking advice from on what you should buy. I kind of call it the Miracle of 34th Street model. If you recall that movie, Santa Claus gets a job at Macy's, and they're all excited because he looks so much like the real Santa, because he is the real Santa. And they go to check on what he's doing, and they overhear him sending a mom who's looking for, I think, a fire truck or something like that, but recommends going to Gimbel's, their competitor, because they have a better, cheaper fire truck. And they're like, oh no, this is freaked out. But the magic of it is Mr. Macy says, there's good wisdom in that, because they're not, they're giving our customer what the customer wants. And of course, they're getting all sorts of feedback from all their customers saying, this is great. You're putting, the kids ahead of just the profit making. And I've always tried to ascribe to that. You might lose something in the near term by saying, well, what we have really isn't the best thing for you right now. You should really try this, that, or the other, especially as a trusted advisor. When people understand that you've got their best interests in mind and not simply making a quota or making margin or selling enough widgets that you've overstocked on, they tend to come back. And I've always been a consultant. I've always been sort of in this trusted advisor role. And I have clients that I've been working with now for 15, 20, 25 years, not all the time. But when they need something, they're like, hey, let me give Jeff a call and see what he has to say. And, so I'm in communication with some people that I've been doing business with over the last, how far back can I think of realistically? At least 20 years, easily. And most often it's because they've retired, not because they don't want to keep talking to me.
So we're getting down towards the end of the show. Is there anything you'd like to share before we close it out?
Gosh, I don't want to be open-ended like that, because I think I've shared a lot. I think there's a lot to chew on here for your listeners. I will say I'll be out in Vegas at Hacker Summer Camp in a few weeks. I'll give a plug for that anyway. I've been selected to speak at Sky Talks, which is this year going to be affiliated with B-Sides Las Vegas, so I'll be around for that. I'll also be around for Black Hat, Paul's Security Weekly, which is now attached to Cyber Risk Alliance, owned by Cyber Risk Alliance. We'll be doing live executive interview sessions as a part of Black Hat. And then at DEF CON, I originally started out wanting to help with the Crypto and Privacy Village, because that's cryptography. And I submitted a CFP to speak at that. And apparently DEF CON's doing this new thing called creator stages, where they're getting speakers from each of the villages and putting them, I guess, in a more professional setting with professional recording equipment and AV equipment. So I was one of the people that was put forth by the Crypto and Privacy Village. So I'll be speaking at creator stage, whatever that is. So I'll be around Vegas for the whole week of Hacker Summer Camp. If you're going to be out there, always happy to chat and hang out and answer questions and just kind of talk security, talk pen testing, talk whatever.
Well, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join today, and I look forward to seeing you at DEF CON and Black Hat.
Sounds good. Thanks, Phillip.
Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to the Phillip Wylie Show. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. In the meantime, to learn more about Phillip, go to thehackermaker.com and connect with him on LinkedIn and Twitter at Phillip Wylie. Until next time.